He began life in the crowded industrial streets of Derby, the son of a struggling lace manufacturer, at a time when England itself was being remade by machinery, uncertainty and upheaval. Before he was 15, he had crossed the world to South Australia. Before old age, he had reinvented himself again and again across 2 colonies: blacksmith, sawyer, engine driver, landholder, husband, father, grandfather. This is the story of Thomas Rought Dallison and of a life built through adaptation. Stay with us as we explore the story of Thomas Dallison, discover his journey from industrial Derby to colonial New Zealand, and the family he helped establish along the way. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up, and if you like the content and want more, hit the subscribe button and tap that notification bell. Thomas Rought Dallison was born in Derby in 1834, in the parish of St Werburgh, into a household shaped by both industry and religion. His father was a lace manufacturer. His mother came from a deeply Wesleyan Methodist family. Thomas's unusual middle name, Rought, carried family meaning. It was his mother's surname. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Rought, was a Wesleyan minister who had spent decades travelling the English circuits. That tells us something important about the family before we know almost anything else about them. This was a household that valued identity, literacy, discipline, and continuity. The sort of family where names mattered, chapel mattered, respectability mattered. But the world around them was changing very quickly. Thomas was born into Derby at precisely the moment when older trades and older ways of life were beginning to buckle under industrial pressure. The lace trade had once offered independence and status to skilled manufacturers and artisans. By the 1830s and 40s, mechanised production was transforming everything. Factories became larger, machinery became more expensive, competition intensified, economic downturns came hard and often. One recession rolled into another. For families like the Dallisons, life did not collapse all at once. It was more wearing than that. Persistent pressure, uncertainty, trying to keep a household afloat while the ground slowly shifted underneath it. And it was a large household. Thomas grew up surrounded by siblings and half-siblings in what must have been a busy and crowded family home in Sadler Gate. Children were born. Some survived, some did not. That too was part of ordinary 19th century life. Then, through the 1840s, the older generation disappeared one by one. All 4 of Thomas's grandparents died within only a few years of each other. By the time he was 13, they were all gone. That matters because families in this period were often anchored by place and kin. Once those ties weakened, leaving became easier, or perhaps simply more necessary. In 1849, when Thomas was 14 years old, the family boarded the Branken Moor and sailed for South Australia under an assisted migration scheme. Imagine the scale of that moment. A Derby teenager, leaving behind the only streets he had ever known, spending more than 3 months at sea, heading towards a colony he could barely picture. We do not know what Thomas thought about the journey. The records are silent, but he was old enough to understand that this was not a holiday and not temporary. His childhood in England had ended, and in some ways, the story of his life from that point onward becomes a story of repeated reinvention. The family settled in Port Adelaide. His father abandoned lace manufacturing entirely and became a schoolteacher instead. which says quite a lot about colonial life. Skills and identities that mattered in England did not always transfer neatly into a new colony. People adapted or struggled. Thomas adapted. The details of his South Australian years are frustratingly thin. We can glimpse family marriages and growing colonial connections, but other than a reference to some gold digging activity, Thomas himself remains partly out of focus. And oddly enough, that absence tells us something too. Many colonial working men left only scattered traces and records, unless they owned property, entered politics, committed crimes, or died dramatically. Much of ordinary life simply vanished into the gaps. But sometime in the early 1860s, when he was around 30, Thomas crossed another sea, this time to New Zealand. By the mid-1860s, Thomas was living in the Wellington district, working as a blacksmith around Pāhautanui, modern Pāwatahanui. Again, reinvention. Not lace manufacturing, not teaching, not the world of Derby at all. A blacksmith in the rough colonial interior needed practical skill and adaptability. Horses, carts, tools, fittings, repairs. Communities depended on tradesmen like him. And then in 1867, Thomas married Jane Wilson, an Irish immigrant from County Westmeath, whose own story we explored in an earlier video. Their first child arrived only weeks later, and almost immediately the family entered the unsettled world of the Rangitikei and Manawatū frontier districts. The New Zealand interior of the 1860s and 1870s was physically demanding country. Bush had to be cleared, roads formed, timber cut, settlements established. It was a world built through relentless labour. By this stage, Thomas had shifted occupations again, this time becoming a sawyer. That work was dangerous, hard, and essential to colonial expansion. Trees became houses, bridges, fences, mills, and towns. Children arrived, the family grew, life took on its rhythms. And then, in 1872, everything stopped for a moment. Their little boy, who carried his father's name, was killed in a bullock cart accident. A dray overturned. The child was struck and killed instantly. The newspaper report is painfully clinical. The inquest was brief, the driver was exonerated, life moved on. But of course, it did not really move on, not entirely. One of the strange things about 19th century records is how calmly terrible events are often described. A few paragraphs in a newspaper, a line in a register, a verdict at an inquest. Yet behind those sparse records was a real family absorbing a real loss. Thomas and Jane carried on because colonial families had little alternative. More children were born, work continued, land was acquired, gradually stability emerged. Over the following years, Thomas changed occupations once more, becoming an engine driver connected to the steam-powered timber economy developing across the Manawatū. And once again, you can almost see the 19th century moving through one man's life. Born into the age of hand industry in Derby, Thomas ended his working life operating machinery at the heart of an industrial colonial economy. In New Zealand, he had also become a landholder. That mattered. Land ownership represented something many migrant families chased for decades: permanence, a measure of security, proof that the years of movement and labour had produced something lasting. His children established their own households around the Pahongana Valley and wider Manawatū district. Gradually, what had once been a wandering migrant family became rooted in one place. And perhaps that is one of the most striking parts of Thomas's story. As a boy, he had watched his family uproot itself from England entirely. As an old man, he lived surrounded by descendants in a settled New Zealand valley. Thomas retired around the beginning of the 20th century and spent his later years living with his son Henry at Pohongina. The movement that had defined so much of his earlier life slowly gave way to stability. He died in 1921, aged 86. His obituary was modest, but one detail stands out. He left behind his wife, 4 surviving children, 35 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. That is an extraordinary transformation within a single lifetime. From the uncertain world of a declining Derby lace trade to a deeply rooted family network in rural New Zealand. Jane died only months later and was buried beside him. After more than half a century together, their graves remained side by side in Pohongina Cemetery. Thomas Rought Dallison did not leave behind speeches, memoirs, or public honours. What survives instead is the outline of an ordinary man navigating an extraordinary century. Industrialisation, immigration, frontier settlement, changing technology, family tragedy, reinvention. Again and again, the world around him changed. Again and again, he adapted to it. And perhaps that is why his life still feels recognisable now. Not because he was exceptional in the heroic sense, but because he kept adjusting, kept rebuilding, kept carrying responsibility forward into uncertain conditions. There is something profoundly human in that. Thomas arrived in New Zealand as a migrant worker. He died as the patriarch of a large, settled family network. And somewhere between those 2 points lies the quiet achievement of his life. One of the most useful lessons from Thomas Rought Dallison's story is that occupations in family history are often more revealing than they first appear. It can be tempting to treat changing occupations as inconsistencies in the record, but for many 19th century migrants, changing work was the story. Thomas appears at different times as a blacksmith, a sawyer, an engine driver, and a landholder. Rather than contradicting one another, those roles map the changing colonial economy around him and show how migrants survived by adapting to new opportunities. If an ancestor seems to shift careers repeatedly, don't assume the records are wrong. Ask instead what those changes reveal about the world they were living through. Because sometimes the occupation is not just a detail beside a name. Sometimes it is the clearest evidence of how a person navigated their entire life. If you have links to the Dallison family, or the locations it is connected with, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Or if you have discovered similar stories of migration, reinvention, or changing occupations in your own family history, feel free to share those as well.